All right, here's the review for our last classroom test for the year. We still have a district test coming up towards the end of May, but this is our last one. So South Asia, here we go. All right, so one of the biggest things we talked about with physical geography was monsoons. Monsoons are seasonal winds that happen in and around the Indian subcontinent. And monsoons are actually, like I said, winds. They're not rainfall, but a lot of people get those things mixed up because everyone thinks about the summer monsoons. So in the summer, the winds are blowing over the ocean. So if you look down at the bottom, the winds are blowing this way. And if they're blowing from the ocean, they're going to, because that's warm water, we're going to have more evaporation of moisture, and that's going to carry precipitation into the Indian subcontinent. So we see very significant amounts of rain, 30, 40 inches of rain a month during the monsoon seasons in the summer. In the winter, though, the winds are reversed. So those winds, if you look up at the map again, the winds are coming over the rest of the Asian continent, trying to blow over the Himalayas. And there's no major body of water there, so if there's no body of water, it's not going to be carrying any moisture. So their winters are actually very dry. They're cool. They're not too cold, but they're very dry winters. All right, so where the majority of the Indian population lives within the Indo-Gangetic Plain, the climate is humid subtropical. That's the same climate that we have here in Houston. We're at about 29 degrees north on our latitude, and if you look at the map, they're right around there. So that makes sense as far as the latitude, right? The temperatures, they are a little bit warmer and they are a little bit more wet just because of the monsoon seasons. But climate in India is very close to what ours is here. As far as the number 3, how does the physical geography of India impact their economic activity? That high amount of rainfall, just like here, high rainfall, warm year-round, not too harsh of winters, creates fertile soil, which means lots of agriculture is taking place in India. Now, most of the farming here, if you look at the legend, is subsistence farming, right? So because of India's economic development, they don't have too much commercial agriculture. So it's mostly just people fending for themselves, doing what they can to survive. We talked a lot about women's issues here in this unit as part of our objective from the state, which is to look at the contributions of underrepresented populations. We see an issue with, and historically, there being less education for women in India. However, that has been changing over the past 10 to 15 years. Job opportunities and the discrimination there because of them being female, they have a hard time finding traditional jobs and sometimes have to work within marketplaces. The male preference of children, as a male child is the one to take care of their parents in their old age. We saw selective abortions, and we could see that the population pyramids that we studied showed that the difference between boys and girls on the population pyramid, and child brides. So we watched our documentary on that and how traditionally in these rural areas, girls are married off very young so that they are not a burden to their family. Religions-wise in the region, India is predominantly Hindu. Probably about 90% at this point is Hindu. Remember that Hindus believe in reincarnation. Their main god is Brahma. They meditate to help them in life, and they have the caste system which ranks them based on their previous karma in their past life, hoping that by fulfilling your duty, your dharma, that you will transcend and move into a better caste in the next life. In Pakistan and Bangladesh, we are seeing mostly a predominance in Islam, which we see has spread from Southwest Asia into South Asia. Now, remember that Muslims and Hindus used to live all in one country together, and then when Great Britain lost India as a colony, India gained its independence, we saw this mass movement of religious people moving from the Hindus trying to stay in India and the Muslims moving out to East and West Pakistan, which then became Bangladesh. All right, so I just went over some of these things about Hinduism, but let's go over it again. Hinduism is the indigenous historic religion to South Asia. We don't find it in other places in the world other than people who have moved, and it's just in its not as diffused as other religions. So when you think of India, you should think of Hindu. Again, many consider Hinduism to be polytheistic, a reincarnation of one major supreme being, Brahma. So you can see in this top picture where that kind of discrepancy is, right? So like if there's one God and he has thousands of reincarnations, some people would say that's polytheistic, other people say monotheistic, so depends on which Hindus you're talking to. But again, that idea of rebirth in your next life and karma, the things that you do in this life will impact your next life, is pivotal to their beliefs. We also looked at the Ganges River, and that is the sacred river to the Hindu people. They do spiritual cleansing here at the Ganges River. Burials are done at the Ganges River. This water is used for irrigation, for shipping, and people moving with boats down the Ganges River. But obviously there's an impact there on the environment as well, right? So there's a high amount of pollution with the Ganges River, but it's so important to the people that you can't really stop these funeral pyres or these spiritual cleansings and those kind of things that are contributing to the pollution, as well as other industrial runoff issues. All right, so we talked about some pretty interesting things with economics in this region of the world. First with outsourcing, right? So outsourcing is when you send away work to another place. This can be done in the United States to another city or to another company, but it's also done when a country goes and locates a factory or something in another part of the world, or a call center, those kind of things. In India, we do see the call centers because of their British heritage. It makes it easier to communicate because they speak English already, and also they are 12 hours ahead of us. So if you're 12 hours ahead of us, that means at nighttime here, it's daytime there. So we can get kind of 24-hour support with service industry work with outsourcing. Obviously, people have an issue with outsourcing. Pay is usually less, especially when we're talking about like manufacturing, clothing, and that kind of thing. But it does provide jobs to the people of South Asia as well, which helps their development, and it helps businesses here in the United States make more money. We also looked at microcredits. Remember, micro means small, and credit is a loan. So it's literally small loans that are given to new businesses in less developed countries. These are not done to make money off the people. Typically, with loans in the United States, you would have, like let's say for college, you would have a high interest rate because those businesses want to make money by offering you the money up front. You then have to pay them back a little bit more. Microcredits are not like that. Microcredits are little loans that are given to a lot of women or small groups of people, even if it's just $100, to start their own business, to be able to buy a sewing machine or to buy a cow so that they can start a little business, but it's doable to pay back off. This is done by, microcredits are given by groups of people who are trying to help the region develop. It's not done by countries really, or by businesses trying to make money. They've been very successful with helping people start their own businesses in India. India's economy is changing. We read in our articles that with all of the things that have been happening in India, they've gone from less developed to newly industrialized, especially as they have this young working population that gets to working age. And they have given the people more freedom in working. So there's more, we're getting further away from socialism and more towards free enterprise. So India, remember, is the world's largest democracy, but their government was regulated a lot for a long time. So we have seen their loosening of that, moving them towards free enterprise. Population-wise, the population of India is somewhere between 1.2 to 1.3 billion. It is one of the largest populated countries. It's number 2 on the list, with China as number 1. In about 15 or 20 years, they will overtake China's population because of China's one-child policy. Even though that one-child policy is over now in China, it significantly reduced their population growth, whereas India's was much, even though they have reduced their population growth, it's still over, the average woman still has more than 2 children. As we've talked about population in India, we also looked at overpopulation, right, and the use of the resources. If you remember from our DBQ lesson with the traffic and that type of thing, this intense population growth has meant that there's been more pollution in India, more spread of disease, crowded cities, lack of roads and bridges that they need, because the government and the land has not been able to keep up with the need from the people. And then we've also, like I said, the pollution of the Ganges River, terrace farming in some of the areas that are more mountainous, and the possibility of India exceeding their carrying capacity. There's just not enough resources for the amount of people that they have. Right, so let's look at a population density map of South Asia and see where most people live. So if we're looking at the legend, the darker the color, right, the more people that live there. So the areas that are purple have the most population. So if we're going to circle that area, hopefully you're remembering from our physical geography stuff that this is the Indo-Gangetic Plain, all that fertile soil and the importance of the Ganges River. That is where people live. Almost 600 million people live right there in that small portion of land. And then we have the areas of lowest population. So let's look for the kind of the cream colors or the yellow colors. And hopefully you know that it would be located here in the Himalayan mountains, right? So Himalayan mountains or the Hindu Kush mountains over in this area, because of the rough terrain and the lack of arable land, they have a pretty low amount of population density. The major cities, if we want to look at major cities, let's see, back at our legend, metropolitan area greater than 10 million. So I see Dhaka, right here in Bangladesh. I see Kolkata. I see Delhi. I see Mumbai. And I see Karachi in Pakistan. Those are going to be our mega cities that are located in this region. So think about the size of the United States compared to India. We have 2 mega cities where South Asia has 5 and a much smaller amount of land. All right, I referenced this a little bit earlier, but let's talk through Indian independence and what that looked like. So India had been a colony of Great Britain for a while, I think like 60, 70 years or something like that. And you read in your article about this that India had helped out during World War II, had fought for Great Britain during that time, and they were promised freedom, and it didn't come after the end of World War II. So that kind of spurred on this independence movement. There was also the Rowlatt Acts that happened where anyone who was considered suspicious by the British government, they could be imprisoned. So all of those things and many other details led Gandhi, who was a lawyer, who kind of became a spokesperson to the Indian independence. He leads India to independence in 1947. He wanted to stay unified, but that did not happen. We did see a partition or a division at that time. So remember the word, looking at the word partition, it just means to part. Just like you would have a partition kind of splitting a classroom or something like that, or a building where you can break it up into smaller pieces. That's what we're seeing here in the map to the right. So look at the map for a second. Please notice the arrows. There was a massive movement of people. I referenced this earlier as well when we were talking about the religions. There was just a lot of religious conflict happening. So what people decided to do was to be with people with their own majority. So any Hindus that were living in the East and West Pakistan areas before, because remember that wasn't East and West Pakistan until independence, they moved to where there was more population that was Hindu. The Muslims that were in what is now known as India, they were a minority in that region, so they moved to a place where they would be within the majority, so as to stop the discrimination and the violence between them. Gandhi's type of leadership in India was one of civil disobedience. It was leading marches, going on hunger strikes, but not a violent way of reaching a goal. He influenced Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement in the United States, but a lot of people say that the success of the Indian independence comes from this idea of civil disobedience. Like I said earlier, India is a democratic republic. It has a president. It has kind of its parliamentary republic, so they have a legislative branch that represents the people. And the people have the freedom to vote freely for multiple political parties and that type of thing. We did also learn about an area called Kashmir. Kashmir is this area in northern India, let me circle it for you, located right here, that has been fought over by India, Pakistan, and China. China has this piece here, and the people really aren't, the Indians and Pakistanis have not focused on that piece that China claims, but the rest of it, Kashmir, it's an area that they've both fought over for a long time. It's the source of the Indus River up there. It's a blended area culturally that they basically have been threatening each other to try to claim this territory. Remember that India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons. They are both growing powers in the world, and this conflict zone has created this fear that there might be nuclear war over Kashmir, and it has been something that's been fought over, even with the UN trying to help with peace agreements. It has been fought over for about over 50 years. All right, this is a good time to talk about the differences between cultural convergence and divergence again. So now the rest of 23 through 27 on your review sheet are all kind of review concepts that you need to make sure you know. So remember that cultural convergence is when things come together. Think about convergent plate boundaries. We have blending. So it starts with diffusion, but then it's a blending when it gets there. So for example, there are McDonald's in India that do not sell beef. Their hamburgers are not hamburgers. They're made with, they're veggie burgers. And that is to appeal to the people that live there, right? So it's a blending of American culture and Indian culture. That's convergence. When it just moves to a different place, that is just diffusion, right? It's a movement. Convergence is what happens when it's there and it blends together. Now, divergence is separating, right? So we've talked about like the Amish here in the United States, right? The Amish separate themselves religiously so they can be focused on God. But we've also seen divergence in the Indian subcontinent. Think about Nepal or Bhutan, these areas, if you look on the map, that are in the Himalayan mountains that are just kind of cut off from the rest of the world because of their location in the mountains. That is also divergence, even though it's unintentional. The one that I want to talk about as well is with Indian independence. We saw the separation, like I had talked about in the last section, that we see the movement of people based on their religion. So the Hindu majority India and the Muslim majority Pakistan, that was also divergence, again, to try to keep religious peace between the two groups. All right, again, population pyramids and climographs, every single test, every single time. Let's look at them maybe a different way, or maybe you can make sure to stop and pay attention to what we're talking about real quickly so that we can try to interpret this. All right, so we have a population pyramid of India, and it says the year 2012. So I know this is relatively current, and I'm going to look at the general shape. It looks like, generally speaking, it has been rapid growth for a long time, right? When you see that slope, you can almost think of it like a pregnant woman, right, with her belly growing. We see that growth of its population. That means the birth rate has increased year after year after year as people have lived longer and healthier lives and more access to medicine. People have lived longer, and also are able to keep, we're having lower infant mortality rates. We have seen a drop off a little bit in the past 15 years. You can see that slope of the rapid growth is maybe not as extreme. You could almost say it's close to slow growth as well. But with this large group, if we look at the largest group, right, we see the young children are the largest group here. You need more schools, more daycares to take care of these children. Climagraphs. So we talked about the monsoon seasons, right? So this is a good example of that. Again, even if you don't know millimeters or Celsius, you don't necessarily need that, right? Let's just try to pay attention to the trends that are happening to the shape of the climagraphs. So we see temperature-wise, it stays between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius, so that would be like 65 to 85 degrees Celsius or so. I may be off a little bit on my conversions, but very little change, right? You know that they have to be pretty close to the equator if that temperature line stays pretty consistent, right? Ours makes a much larger increase in the summer than what they see. As far as the rainfall, we see a large amount of rainfall in the summer months, so and then we see a lot less in the winter months. So this is our monsoon season. This is when those monsoon winds are blowing in over the ocean and bringing all of that moisture to India, whereas the winter, those monsoon winds reverse. A couple of other review things, plate boundaries, right? We talked about the Himalayan mountains. That's kind of our major physical fault line here. Remember that India, the Indian subcontinent, was its own plate. It was not connected to the rest of Asia, and it pushed into the Asian, the Eurasian continent, and that pushing is a convergent plate boundary right here. Okay, and when you have land-on-land convergent boundaries, you get mountains because those plates just crush up and push each other up there. So the Himalayas are the tallest mountains in the world, and they are continually growing a couple inches each year. Let's look at demographics, all right? So it says, except for the U.S., which of the following is less developed and which of the following countries is more developed? Okay, so let's look at some of this stuff here. Remember that there could be lots of different demographics we look at. Some demographics do not help. Pay attention, please. Demographics can tell you a lot about a country, but not all of them tell you the level of development. For example, population. We can't necessarily tell with population how developed a country is going to be. Just because you have a large population does not mean that you are less developed. Look at the difference between with the United States and Nepal, right? If you're thinking, well, a high population means that you're less developed, well, we have a much higher population in the United States than Nepal, right? So that that might seem that Nepal might be more developed, but if you look at the life expectancy, we live 20 years longer than Nepal. So that definitely can't be used. So population is interesting to know, but not going to help us with levels of development. So I want to think, and this might be something you can think about as well when you take the test, is do you want these things to be high or low, right? Life expectancy, you want that to be high, and literacy rate, you want to be high. So this one's a little bit easier, but things that you might want lower of is infant mortality rate. You don't want that number to be high because that shows that there's less development. So because these are both positive things that we want higher numbers of, that makes it a little bit easier. Again, I'm not including the United States. I see the highest one after that is Sri Lanka. Let me just verify with the literacy rate. Now, it's not the highest literacy rate, again, because don't forget not to include the United States, but it is in the region at 91%. So I'm going to say Sri Lanka is more developed, and less developed, I'm going to look, this has Nepal has the lowest life expectancy. It also has the lowest literacy rate. So I would say Nepal is the less developed based on these demographics. If you get other demographics, those answers might change. Don't just assume that Nepal is always the least developed in the region. But you might be able to use some of that comparatively. All right, I'm going to give you a second to pause the video so you can reread through this information, write some notes down, and then we will label on the next slide. So go ahead and pause the video and get this information written down. Please note that we have labeled the map with the letters that are on the review sheet, so that way it helps you when you're studying. I think this is a great way to study because it allows you to work with somebody else, or cover up the left side of your paper and then study with that, or cover up at least the letter choices and that kind of thing. So it gives you a way of quizzing yourself. But I've also given you a map with all of the things labeled, so you can do that however you would like. You do need to know the locations of all of these. There are 8 mapping on the test, so make sure that you study this. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask your teacher before the test, and I will see you all next time.